My name's Arup Chakrabarty. Really honored and humbled to be back here at DevOpsDays Tel Aviv. I was here 2 years ago. I was here 2 years ago at DevOpsDays Tel Aviv. Had just an amazing time. I love how welcoming and hospitable all Israelis are, and just last time I was here, I had multiple folks offer to give me rides around the city and tour guides, and this time didn't need the tour guide, but I was out to dinner on Sunday night with some folks from the conference, and they refused to let me take a cab home because you're all so hospitable. So thank you for being so welcoming and making my life a lot easier so I don't have to expense cab receipts. So thank you for that. Also, I want to thank all the organizers specifically. If you see any of the organizers with, they'll say organizer on their badge, please thank them. There's a lot of work that goes into running these kinds of conferences at this kind of scale and with this many people. And if there's any kinds of folks that can appreciate how much work it goes into making things run smoothly, it's all of you, because that's what all of you do in your day job. So please thank them profusely if you do see them with anyone with their organizer badge on. And lastly, I have my Twitter handle up here, and it'll be on all my slides. So if you do have feedback throughout the talk, please feel free to message me directly or just tweet out. With that said, I'm going to take my phone and put it over here so I do not respond to your angry tweets during my talk. All right, so let's get started here. Let me turn on my clicker. So really quickly, agenda. What I'll start with is laying out some context about myself and PagerDuty, kind of what we do at my company, and a little bit more about myself. Then I'll dive into where we were at the beginning of 2016. So this talk is very much a timeline-based talk where I'm going to go through where we were from a snapshot standpoint and multiple times throughout 2016 as we were kind of going through our own internal DevOps transformation at the company. I'll walk through some of the organizational and technical changes that we made, kind of piggyback off of Corey's talk today. A lot of the things that I'm going to be talking about are similar, that a lot of it's about people, but there's also some technology changes that we made on our end to make some of these things easier. Then I'll also walk through some of the validation that we did throughout, not just the changes themselves, but kind of afterwards a year later, and kind of looking back from where we are now, whether we did the right things or not. And lastly, all these slides will be posted on SpeakerDeck online. I'll tweet them out. So if you miss a picture or if you didn't get a note, don't worry about it. It'll all get posted online later today, or later this evening. So, who am I? This is to get over my own insecurities, like Corey talked about, and why I think some folks should listen to me. I actually started out in academic research. I don't know who caught Gil's talk yesterday on DICOM and HIPAA, but that's actually where I got my start about 15 years ago, studying MRI imaging data. And I am so glad that Gil is the one dealing with that stuff and not me anymore, because it is really, really hard. So if you see Gil today, please give him a pat on the back. I have nothing but the utmost respect for folks that can do that kind of work. I spent some time at Amazon, then Netflix, and currently I work at PagerDuty, where I get to work with our infrastructure engineering teams at the company. Before I get into the meat of the talk, some quick disclaimers. I'm not a smart person, nor do I pretend to be, but I work with very smart people, and I'm very lucky and I'm very privileged to work with the engineers that I get to work with on a daily basis. And while I'm up here talking about this stuff and I have conviction and a lot of belief around it, I did not come up with everything, and I will not pretend for a second that I did. I'm up here merely as a talking head on behalf of a lot of really, really smart people that I get to work with. The big takeaway here, it takes teams of highly aligned people to get any of this stuff done that I'm going to be talking about today. Similarly, this will not work for you. Please do not take what I'm talking about today and treat it as a playbook. Don't go out there and copy it verbatim. And I'll tell you why. If you go to your boss tomorrow and say, hey, this goofus named Arup at this DevOps Days conference told me to do this, here's what happens. Your boss, chances are, knows my boss. He sends an email to my boss and says, hey, why is your idiot direct telling my teams to do these things without any context? So please don't get me into trouble. I don't want that, because that also means you get into trouble, which I don't want either. So what I do want you to do, take this material, digest it, read over the slides. Next week, after you get a good weekend in and some process and you've digested it, contextualize this information, figure out what you think might work for your organizations, and then apply it. Please do not apply this stuff verbatim. There are strengths that PagerDuty has last year that I was able to leverage and exploit that none of you have. But likewise, my organization also has weaknesses that none of you have, which I have no idea what they are. So please understand what those strengths and weaknesses are so you can exploit them and be successful. Lazy leaders copy information verbatim. Don't be a lazy leader. All right, so quick 15-second pitch on what is PagerDuty. This is our architecture diagram. It's a very technical diagram here. Basically, you can think of us, actually, so quick show of hands, who's heard of PagerDuty before or used the product? Oh, fantastic, this makes my life even easier. So on the left, you have unhappy customers, whether it's increased error rates, slower web page, downtime, what have you. In the middle, magic. That's what I get to work on my day job. On the right is all of you, the resolvers that we help connect via all that magic. All right, so January 2016. So let's go back. Let's go back almost 2 years now and think about kind of where you were in January 2016. I'll talk about myself a little bit. Fewer gray hairs, I have fewer wrinkles, fewer gray hairs in my beard. That's the weird one, really. That really throws me off. Remember the Zika virus? That happened January 2016. We were all freaking out about that. Still keeps me up. Google Code was discontinued. Remember that? They finally decided that, maybe GitHub's winning on this one. Likewise, Google AMP, that accelerated mobile nonsense, was also introduced. So every time you search for a news article now and wonder why on your mobile device, the scroll is all weird and strange. Yeah, that started in January 2016. So this is what our org chart looked like in January 2016. Nothing too crazy here. We had VP of engineering, we had operations reliability, and product functionalities at the company. And this is pretty typical, right? You've probably seen org charts like this. And on the left here, we have our operations team responsible for all the servers. So if a server died, the operations team was responsible for replacing it. Databases as well, Cassandra, MySQL, Zookeeper. I think we had some Memcache floating around as well. They were responsible for all the configuration tuning, everything with the databases, load balancers, network, all that kind of stuff you typically associate with an operations responsibility. Next was a reliability team. Now, this isn't an SRE function. I'll get to that later. That's not how we were viewing this function at the company at the time. This team was primarily focused on backend services, and the system reliability of those backend services was super important. Again, PagerDuty, this is something that we take for granted, that I take for granted sometimes, that my engineers care about reliability, especially for our backend systems. Then we had a product functionality. So anything that you interacted with as a customer, whether it was a website, our APIs, anything on our mobile app, anything that you touched or interfaced with, that was run by this product organization that we had. And they were also responsible for front-end services and anything customer-facing. Now, there were some problems with this. And you'll probably figure out very quickly what word I don't like here, but we had a centralized operations responsibility, centralized reliability responsibility, and centralized product responsibility. And look, there's books abound written on in businesses whether you should centralize or decentralize something, and I don't want to get into that debate. But for us, at least, at this point in time, the centralization was really holding us back from delivering quickly on and promising on making our promises on what the business needed. God help you, if you wanted to create a new service that required a new database and some back-end logic and a dynamic web page, it took you weeks at minimum in our organization. Wow, I'm already getting questions. Go ahead.
How many people in our engineering organization at this stage?
At this point, we had about 70 people in our engineering organization. Good question. So we were holding the business back by having all the centralization. There was a lot of coordination that we had to do across our teams. So that's when myself, a handful of our engineers, and our engineering managers decided to come up with a heist. So what is a heist? Words are important, so let's define it. A heist is a crime in which valuable things are taken illegally and often violently from a person or people, and this is terrifying. So to be clear, there's no violence at PagerDuty at this time. I did a little bit of more research. This was actually associated with when they would transport goods via caravans back in the day with armored caravans and armored guards, and then thieves would come and knock someone over the head and steal all their gold or jewelry. That's not what happened here. So there's no violence at PagerDuty. We are not a violent company. We don't try to be, nor do we aspire to be. I've tried to find another definition that I think was a little bit more appropriate for what I was positioning and proposing to our engineers. And so here's another one. The act of selling something to someone without them knowing what they're going to pay for it. also known as fraud. So I went with the word heist because I think it's a better title. So really it should have been the great PagerDuty DevOps fraud, but I don't like to be associated with fraud. I think heist is the funnier title, so I apologize for an incorrect title, but it got you in here, so it worked. All right, so the heist. What were we selling to the teams? What was this? What was the goods that they were going to receive? Well, there were a couple of ideas that I really wanted to instill in our teams. The first was that our business success depends on innovation. Again, we use the word innovation a lot in our industry. Many of your companies always are saying they want to innovate quickly. No one says they ever want to not innovate. I also postulated that innovation depends on the rate of change. The faster you change things, the more you're going to innovate. So the last bit here is what's important is that we were going to increase the rate of change by having engineers own more of the stack. So that was what I was selling to the teams. That was really what I was proposing that we were going to adopt. So that was January 2016. Let's fast forward a couple months to March 2016. So in 2 months, we made a bunch of changes to the organization, and this is what we started to look like. So on the left here, we took that operations function and we folded a couple other teams under there, and we created what we call an infrastructure products organization. Things like SRE, internal platform security, these are the teams that were now responsible for providing product and services to the rest of the engineering organization. What was interesting though was we now made all of our, what we'll call our product teams, basically equivalent. They were now responsible for the servers, for the databases, meaning that if a server died, if a disk went bad or something like that, because AWS, Google, Azure will take that instance from you whether you like it or not, the product team alpha got paged, not the operations team because that was gone, not the SRE team, that was not their responsibility anymore. This created more problems, of course. So these problems tended to be a little bit more human focused. So first was people working with new people. All of a sudden we had rearranged a bunch of our teams to have complementary skill sets, and I got this question: who's that guy? Who's that gal? What are they doing on my team? Why are they sitting next to me? I don't like their deodorant. Talk to them about it. What is this? What is this technology? We had hired a bunch of teams that were focused primarily on back-end services, and now we were saying, hey, we kind of want you to own the full stack now, so you're going to have to write some JavaScript. Hey, team that was focused primarily on front-end, you're going to have to write a little bit of Scala now. So there was a lot of stress that came with that, because all of a sudden we had hired engineers and said, yeah, just kidding. So lots of changes going on. But to me, there's really one thing that changed. So, what is it that changed? The job changed. As an engineer at PagerDuty, the job had changed from being a very specialized skill set to kind of more of that full stack, whatever you want to call it, engineer. And for previous development-focused folks, they now own the entire vertical stack. These are some individuals that had never written a SQL query that were now responsible for administering some of their own databases. These were folks that had no idea what a Lua was, that now had to think about what does a load balancer do. We really adopted this mantra of code it, ship it, own it. We heard this yesterday in one of the keynotes of you build it, you run it. Again, Werner Vogel, I can't pronounce his name, the CTO at Amazon talked about this years ago. Now, also interesting for folks that were previously more operations focused, they now had to empower others to do their previous jobs effectively. And think about that for a second. You have these operations professionals that have been doing this for decades that, understand kernel performance tuning like none other, and you're telling them, hey, you need to help someone else do your job just as effectively, and by the way, you have a couple days. Decades of experience, figure out how to distill that into a couple days. Okay, fine, maybe a week. And that was it. And they were also tasked with making the right thing, the easy thing, and this is hard. This is really, really hard, and I heard this a lot. I need to do what now? Wait, what? You changed my job? How dare you? And with any kind of change comes a lot of anxiety. And that is something that I think goes very unnoticed, and especially as leaders, when we introduce changes into organizations, I don't think we actually pay enough attention to that. The amount of anxiety, the amount of stress, the amount of strain that we're putting on our engineers when we talk about these changes or propose these changes. So to help kind of combat and reduce that anxiety, we did introduce some tooling, and we adopted this philosophy of self-service tooling with the idea that we wanted individual engineers and individual teams to be able to do as much as they could on their own. And this was an attempt. We didn't know that this was going to work at the time. This is a belief that I had, but and here's what we built. And some of this wasn't all built internally. We used vendors where was appropriate. The first thing we did was make server provisioning completely self-service. So what used to be something where you had to file a ticket, go bribe an engineer, tame the ops dragon, what have you, all of a sudden became a chatbot tool. We gave engineers access to the AWS console where they needed it. And we said, hey, if you want to provision and decommission your own servers, here you go, because guess what? You're on call for it. So you need that ability to do your job effectively. We also focus on self-service metrics and telemetry and alerting. So we use Datadog, New Relic, and Splunk very heavily internally at PagerDuty. And we used to have a bunch of gates in place for engineers. They either had to file tickets with the appropriate team because the alert might not get set up correctly. And instead, we opened it up. We said, hey, engineering teams, go nuts. And I kind of stood on the sidelines to see what would happen. Self-service deployment, we adopted this philosophy of merge to production. So what that meant was if you hit the green button in GitHub that says merge, that would end up in production within 10 minutes. That was the philosophy that we had taken on as an engineering organization, that we want to make it as easy as possible for any engineer to deploy any code base. We also focus on creating common infrastructure components. So an example of this was one of our internal platform team, they focus on setting up an internal Kafka cluster to make it easy to share data between services. We set up Consul internally, where it was easy to do service discovery, and we focused quite a bit on figuring out where did it make sense to add a little bit more centralization back into the process. It doesn't make sense to have multiple service discovery clusters. That is a recipe for disaster. And where we couldn't, we used documentation. Where we couldn't automate or build software or buy something, we used documentation. We invested heavily in making sure that things were documented. We actually had internal experts at our company who were really good at documentation teach others how to document things appropriately to help out. So I started hearing this a little bit more. Okay, I think I can handle that. I want to pause here for a second to talk a little bit about people over tooling. The Agile Manifesto talks about this quite a bit, but I do think as an industry, we often talk too much about tooling and we focus on the tooling instead of the people. And I want to remind everyone that tools don't make up your company unless you work with a bunch of jerks, which I hope you don't. It's people that make up the organizations and the companies that we work at. And I kind of think about why do we talk about tooling so much? Well, it's because we're engineers, right? When we see a problem as an engineer, we have this amazing superpower to reimagine the world around us by building something, and that's awesome. That is amazing, and it's something that makes our industry so wonderful to be a part of. But that is an incredible, dangerous bias that we have. I've made this mistake myself as an engineer where I see a problem and instead of thinking about if it's a people issue or even a process issue, I immediately bias towards building something to solve it. And I'm not saying that you shouldn't build things to solve some of these problems. Sometimes that is the right thing, but just be aware and cognizant of that bias that we all have, that our first reaction to a problem is always to build something. I heard this a little bit. Some of our engineers did quit, not immediately, but they did. And to me, this is always the hard part of leadership. Some changes aren't for everyone, and I never pretended as we were going through these changes ourselves that everyone was going to be happy with it. Some people that thrived in the old ways will struggle in the new ways, and that's frustrating. And as leaders, we want what's best for all of our individuals, but we unfortunately won't be able to cater to every single one of them. And one thing that I always try to remind leaders is that, look, when you have individuals that are struggling in these environments as a result of these changes, they're not trying to be jerks. Very rarely is that actually the case. They're not trying to be toxic. They're not purposely trying to get in the way. They're just expressing their frustration and anxiety about all these changes. Again, going back to what I said earlier, I had asked some of our engineers who had decades of experience to take all experience and transfer it to someone in less than a week. And that is hard. That's not easy, and it undermines a lot of our identities and exposes a lot of our insecurities. And the hard part here is the last bullet point here is anytime you go through these kinds of changes, expect attrition. Expect that it's not going to be for everyone. For us, it was about 5-6% of our engineers. It wasn't for them anymore. I've been in organizations where it gets as high as 20%. And that's hard. That is really hard. And this is where most leaders get stuck. And I always remind managers, my managers in particular, that introducing change is hard, but managing through that change is even harder. Because it's one thing to draft up an email, to post a Slack message and say, hey, here's how we're going to work now. Here's how things are going to be different now. But 6 months later, to remind people about that and constantly remember and focus that, to have that conviction that that was the right thing, that's really, really hard. It's even harder to do. All right, so I've been painting a pretty doom and gloom couple slides. Where are we now? It's November 2017. We're at DevOpsDays Tel Aviv, sharing a lot of our learnings. How did we do as PagerDuty? Well, despite my best efforts, we are still in business somehow. And I'm always biased towards looking towards metrics and data to answer the question, what did progress look like? And another disclaimer here, I did not have all these metrics at the beginning. So I wasn't able to watch all of these as we were going through all these changes, but some of them I discovered throughout the year, some of them I discovered probably towards November, December last year, and got some validation afterwards. So what did progress look like? So the first set of metrics we looked at were our Github metrics. So each of you probably have some sort of version control system. There's probably an API there, and there's some really interesting metrics in there. So I have two of them here. The bars represent the number of pull requests closed on a quarterly basis. And the line represents the median pull request duration. So I'll dig a little bit deeper in what this means. So you can see that there's a kind of a gradual up and to the right, which is good. We were making changes in production about 1,000 times a month towards the end of the year. And the line here, you'll see, has just this complete drop-off. It goes from just over 24 hours to just under 9 hours over the course of a couple months. So what was happening here? So I kind of spot checked of trying to understand what was going on, and really what I discovered was all of a sudden engineers needed less than a day now to get something into production. So the typical workflow that we used to have was where engineer comes in the morning, they write up some code, they queue up some change, and by noon, say 1 p.m. in the afternoon after lunch, it's ready. But they now had to go talk to another engineering team that they were coupled to get that change into production. So they go do that. They would go talk to the engineering team, and they would ask them, hey, hey, dependency team, can you help me get this out by the end of the day? But of course, that other team's been working on something as well. So the other team queues it up. Chances are they didn't get to it that day. They get to it the following morning, and that code gets into production the following day around noon. Again, about 24 hours. After we had made these changes where we had more complementary skill sets on the teams and there was a little bit less decoupling, all of a sudden, the reviews were happening locally to the team. And because teams were working on these features entirely within themselves, people had context about the changes that were going on. So the new workflow was come in the morning, have your coffee, make some changes. By noon, you're ready to deploy to production. You nudge the person next to you, or you post in your Slack team channel saying, hey, can someone give this a review or a +1? They get it within a few minutes because that engineer has the full context of what's going on. And then that goes into production within minutes. Again, less than a day. And we've consistently stayed less than 8 hours for our median pull request time. And again, this isn't the end-all be-all metric, but this was a proxy we used to figure out whether our velocity was increasing or not. Another really interesting code base that we looked at was what we call our Chef repo. And I imagine many of you have probably a repo or a code base like this where all of your infrastructure code logic lives. For us, we use Chef, so all of our logic lives in this single repo. And we decided that, hey, if we want teams to own more of their code and own their servers and all these kinds of changes, we need to open up that repo. And so this is a graph of how many unique engineers we're deploying on a monthly basis to our Chef repo. And it basically doubled, even though the engineering organization only grew from about 80 to 100 people at this time span. We went from about 35 to 75 people regularly committing code to that code base. And so I encourage each of you, if you do have one of these code bases that is kind of under lock and key by a group of individuals, see what happens when you open it up. Again, it was really interesting to see how all we did was, hey, anyone who needs to commit code to this code base, go nuts, and this is what happened. Another interesting metric was our PagerDuty metrics. How many things were we breaking? And I will readily admit, we actually did have an increase in the number of incidents. You can see that there's a kind of a slow up and to the right trend here. And of course, my boss was not too happy about this, but when we normalized this against the number of changes we were making, it ended up actually staying flat over time. So on a per change basis that we were making in production, we were breaking about the same amount of things. I would have loved to have seen this go down over time, normalize against the number of changes, but that was where we were not successful. And the one other good thing that did happen here, at least our time to resolution was going down. So even though we were breaking things more often, it was much smaller in scope and the blast radius was a lot smaller. If you're wondering what that on the left, the giant spike is, this is what happens when Datadog decides to treat no metrics as an alert, and when your automation decides that you should get alerted whenever there's no data in your alerts. All of your engineers get paged for every single alert. So this is what happens when your automation runs a little bit amok. That was a fun night, turning off thousands of alerts. And then lastly, our business metrics. So this is a graph of the number of incidents created within PagerDuty across all of our customers on a per monthly basis. I had to strike out the units, but if you get me drunk, I will tell you what they are. But it's up and to the right. That's the main thing here, that the business kept running and moving along. Even as we were making all these changes throughout 2016, this was actually a metric we were still looking at, like, are we pissing off our customers to the point where they're not using the product anymore? And thankfully that didn't happen. Another interesting couple of data points I had was just anecdotes. And while I'm always a fan of data and I trust data over opinions, anecdotes are important because they can tell a really powerful story. And a couple of my favorite stories, one was we had an intern who had only been at the company 2 months replace our entire Kafka cluster, and none of our customers noticed. No alerts, no outage, no downtime, nothing. We have engineers practicing MySQL recovery for fun. I'm serious. They'll spin up a couple of VMs, they set up replication, they break it, and they practice recovering from a delayed slave locally. Another really interesting data point was I had a team that wanted to build out code coverage metrics completely unsolicited. This wasn't a top-down thing or anything. They just decided, hey, we should understand what our code coverage looks like, and we don't have a centralized QA team or anyone barking orders at them to care about code coverage. They just decided to care about this on their own. So going back to the heist, kind of going back to revisiting, what were we selling to the teams? What we sold them? Again, we will increase the rate of change by having engineers own more of the stack. And as we showed earlier, we did increase the rate of change. I'd like to think we increased the rate of innovation, and the rest of our business was much happier with our rate of delivery. But what did it cost them? All engineers had to go on call. We had the drumbeat, the mantra of code it, ship it, own it. And people left. Again, that last part is the hard one. This is the cost that a lot of organizations don't think about when they introduce these kinds of changes. So, on reflection, did we get it completely right? No. Absolutely not. I screwed up and fucked up so many things throughout the entire year, and I don't pretend for a second that this was the recipe for success for us or for anyone else for that matter. But, when I do reflect and think about at least my one biggest mistake was underestimating the amount of cross-training that we need to be doing as we were introducing these changes. I hinted at it earlier, but that was something that was a big mistake of ours where we only gave teams days or weeks to do some of that cross-training, and that frustrated a lot of our engineers. Specifically around our databases and our data stores, that caused the most amount of anxiety for our teams when they were owning them now. So we've gotten better at this. We actually hired a dedicated data store engineer that he actually spends about half his time training and teaching other people and giving workshops. But that was something we learned probably October of last year, about 6 months into these changes after a lot of our engineers were complaining about it. My biggest surprise, though, where I was very happy, was the willingness of all of our engineers to at least give this a shot. And so while some of our engineers did quit, some of them did say this wasn't for them, they all gave it a shot. They actually gave it about four to 5 months before they decided this wasn't for them, and that was really surprising. I actually thought more of them would have just said, screw this place, it's not for me anymore, I'm out immediately. But they were willing to give it a shot, which made me really happy. And when I think about what made it work kind of at the end of the day, and we did realize the business results that we wanted by the end of the year, I think what made it work was conviction, not just from myself and other leaders throughout the organization, but even from our engineers. They had conviction that, yes, this was the way that we want to try working, and we're not sure if this is going to work, but they had conviction that it was at least worth a shot, and we were able to kind of paint a picture and provide some focus throughout the year that, hey, this is what we're trying to get to, let's keep trying to get there together. That's all I got, folks. If you see any of the organizers, please thank them. It takes a lot of work and a lot of planning, a lot of diligence to throw a conference of this scale. So please, please, please go thank them. And I think, any questions? Sir?
Involved in your flow, and if so, how did it change?
So I have a good story. So the question was, do you have any manual testing in your workflow, and how did that change? So yes, when we started, we actually did. We had a couple of teams that still had a lot of manual smoke testing that they were doing as part of the release process. And one of the really clever hacks that we had a development tooling team as part of our infrastructure products team. One of the really clever hacks that they did was they put everything into a CI server, and they introduced a 10-minute pause step in the workflow. So the intent was to try to get teams to automate more of their testing, but they would hit that merge button. It would then get queued up to go into staging, get released there, and then it would pause for 10 minutes before it would go to production automatically. So within 10 minutes, engineers had to click around and do everything they needed to do their smoke testing, and then it would just go to production. And they had the ability to hit the pause button if they did discover something bad, but it at least got the teams thinking about, okay, how do I use a CI server? Yes, it's a fake step, if it's a fake pause that we put in there, but it worked really well to get our teams to think more about that automated testing. Some of our teams still have it. We keep trying to shrink that time frame from, I think no team has more than 5 minutes of manual testing, and what happens is they'll hit merge, it gets deployed to staging, something will ping them, either Slack or PagerDuty, to say, hey, start your testing. By the way, you have 5 minutes to hit the pause button, and I would say about 99% of the time, it ends up just going into production anyways. Good question. Other questions? Yeah.
You mentioned your standards inside the company.
Yeah, great question. So the question was, we opened up that infrastructure, that Chef code base. How did we ensure code quality and making sure that we had reviewers? So what we started was, I set an explicit expectation on the team that quote unquote owned the Chef repo previously, that you can never have more than 5 pull requests open in any given day, meaning that if 6 pull requests got open, it would actually page the on-call engineer to go review the open pull requests. And that kind of got them in that mindset, that kind of customer-focused mindset that, hey, we need to be reviewing the pull requests for other teams. Now, that very quickly became a bottleneck. So then we actually created, it was a really goofy way we did this, but we started giving out totems to individuals that, after they had reached a certain number of pull requests successfully against that code base, they get a little totem on their desk saying they were Chef approved. And it was a low number, it was like 5. It wasn't like a big number or anything. But the idea was to kind of create that community around that code base and to kind of spread the best practice as much as we could. So slowly but surely that grew to the point where we now had people within every team that was quote unquote approved to make those changes and review them. And so that's how we started. So started with that small group with an aggressive customer focus on doing reviews, then training other engineers, and then it just didn't matter anymore after that. Perfect. One more question? Yeah. So I'm gonna summarize the question, make sure I do it justice. So the question was, so all your teams are working this different ways. Now, how do you make sure that when you're hiring, that you are able to actually find these individuals, and basically, how do you hire unicorns? And the reality is, you don't. You can't hire unicorns. You're never going to find someone with all the skill sets that you need for your organization. And what that means is you have to invest in training. And the other thing that I found that helps with hiring is setting those expectations up front that, hey, as an engineer interviewing at PagerDuty, you will go on call, you will be working on databases, you will be working on load balancers, but you'll have help, you'll have training. And it's interesting because it does create some self-selection there because not everyone's interested in that kind of a role. But yeah, I know that's not the best answer, but don't try to hire unicorns. They don't exist. And if you could, invest in training instead, because you'll get a much better return on your time. And I don't know why more companies don't think like this. They think that unicorns are all hireable, maybe because, going back to Corey's talk earlier, like we get up here and we talk about these things that, all these mythical engineers exist at these big companies. They don't. They don't. No,
You just hire a horse and pin a horn on it.
yeah, hire a horse and pin a horn. That sounds really painful. I said there was no violence at PagerDuty. All right, I think I'm getting booted off here. Thank you so much, folks. If you do have additional questions, feel free to come find me.